Hey, I think we're live. Good evening, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to Hip Hop at 50, Transforming Communities. This is a conversation with Franklin Rossman, an artist and an educator. I'm your moderator for this evening, Rob Markman. Journalist, veteran journalist. I've interviewed the likes of Jay-Z and Drake and Lil Wayne and you name it. But I'm very honored. And tonight is going to be a special night with a conversation with somebody who I consider a friend, and who I deeply respect everything that they do in the hip hop community. Franklin Rossman, welcome, man.
Thank you. Good evening. I just want to say as well, man, it's a pleasure to be here to share space with you as well, and just kind of talk about my journey through music, education, and all of that. I'm really excited.
Great. And I'm really excited for all y'all who have tuned in. One note, we will be taking questions from everybody tuning in, or whoever has questions, as many as we can towards the end of this discussion. Maybe we'll save the last 15 minutes for questions. So please submit your questions on social media, in the chat, and we'll get to as many questions as we can towards the end. And also, before we start, I'd like to thank the American Embassy in Moscow for allowing us to do this. And again, thank you for everybody for being here. Franklin, I guess we start off with your discovery of hip hop, because this discussion is going to be like hip hop and community. So I'd like to start off on a very personal level of how you discovered hip hop, how you fell in love with hip hop, and then we'll go out from there and talk about the world around you and what was going on in the world around you. So just very simple question. What was it that made you fall in love with hip hop? Where were you? How old were you? Like, what was going on?
It's so funny because it's not a loaded question by any means, but I think there's a very robust answer, right? Like, I think my first memories of hip hop was just in the house, my older sister listening to hip hop. I remember the Pee Wee dance, right? I remember seeing the vinyl for Run DMC, all of those things. I think like when I was old enough to really digest it and process what it was, I think so much of it was watching Video Music Box. For those of you who do not know, Video Music Box is a show that's been longstanding. It's been running for decades, hosted by Ralph McDaniels, who's an ambassador of hip hop, Uncle Ralph, as we like to call him. And it would come on at 3:30. And one of the things that I knew was like coming home after school, we had to be inside to see Video Music Box because that was the gateway to the newest music, the newest dances, the newest artists, everything. And that really fueled a lot of my love, just consuming artists like Big Daddy Kane, Rakim, Slick Rick. Also just listening to the radio every night. In New York, we had WBLS. We also had Kiss FM. And either at nighttime or on the weekends or Fridays or Saturdays, that's where I tuned in. And I'm probably 8 around this time that I'm speaking of. But it was really about just listening to Red Alert and losing my mind hearing Queen Latifah for the first time and hearing the Jungle Brothers or Marley Marl on the other end of the dial. Those were the moments that really stand out in my mind where I fell in love with it. Like I was so consumed by it. I was running to the newsstands on my way to school and spending the little money I did have to buy magazines like Word Up or Rap Masters.
Right. No, okay. So, just to add some context into that, I mean, you're talking about the mid to late 80s. I'm just capturing the cultural clues, the Video Music Boxes, the BLS and Kiss FM. And so this is the mid to late 80s. I think it's important to paint the picture because hip hop is global now. Shout out to Moscow, we're across the world, but no, hip hop is very global and far reaching. The biggest genre in the world, I like to say. But during the time period that you're talking about, it was very niche. Hip hop, when you're talking about WBLS or Kiss FM in New York City, these radio stations only played hip hop at night for an hour or two. It wasn't like you could just turn on the radio at any time and hear your favorite rap song. You talk about Video Music Box coming on at 3:30. You had to be in a certain place and at a certain time. It was appointment viewing. It was appointment listening. Hip hop wasn't the juggernaut that it is now. It was more niche. Talk about how niche it was, how much you had to seek it out rather than
absolutely. And yes, to contextualize it, I think that the thing about hip hop then, even as a kid, it was very insular, right? It wasn't readily available. We only were able to get hip hop on the radio for an hour, maybe two a night. When I reference Video Music Box, that show was on for an hour from 3:30 to 4:30 every day. And those were our only outlets. If I wanted more hip hop, or if I wanted to consume more hip hop, I literally had to wait until Alert would have, you know, a 3 or 4 hour set on the radio. Other than that, you know, there wasn't much hip hop available or accessible to us in that way. You know, I think that's where community really started to build, because, you know, from these 1 hour shows, whether it was Video Music Box or what was the show with D Barnes, Pump It Up, right? We would legitimately talk about that the next day or the following Monday on a schoolyard, you know, because there was this understanding that you had to seek it out if you wanted it. You know, it wasn't just ubiquitous, and as you said, this juggernaut, this readily available, and it's just like this worldwide phenomenon. It was something that was really small, and in so many ways community-based. And also, even before that, I think that, you know, living in New York City, there was definitely a privilege of witnessing hip hop on the ground. Like, I remember being incredibly young, and I mean so young that my mom is probably still holding my hand walking on the sidewalk, but seeing dudes breaking, you know. Also just seeing the trains in New York City pull into a station and fully bombed with graffiti all over it. So that was part of the experience of consuming hip hop at a really young age and just being enamored with it, right? And I think it's important to note that mainstream media, a lot of times, the media at large, just didn't think it was going to last. It was a fad. So, you know, I think as the young gatekeepers of it, you know, as the young treasurers of this art form and discipline, it was really important for us to speak about it, spread the word, share in it, participate in it in whatever ways that we could.
Outside of the artistic merit, right, and attraction of hip hop, growing up in New York in the 1980s, you know, and hip hop was birthed in the 70s, really flourished in the 80s. Can you describe what was going on in the community at that time that also made hip hop necessary as a beacon for messaging for the rest of the world to hear?
Absolutely. You know, I think when you think about the socioeconomic living conditions of most people in New York, in urban areas, in the Bronx and Brooklyn, you know, we're talking about communities that were really just decimated by crack, one, gun violence, you know. And I think that the messaging in hip hop, especially when I was growing up, was so important for a young person such as myself, even though like there were strong values being instilled by my parents, by other community members and stakeholders, right? Hearing things like self-destruction from KRS-One and Big Daddy Kane or MC Lyte, you know, hearing, you know, Young, Gifted, and Black. These were important messages that were super resonant, because it definitely instilled a pride in who I was and what I could be, and it was aspirational as well. And I think when you juxtapose what many people's living conditions were and what hip hop was at that time, and because I felt like there was also a unified front in this messaging of positivity and consciousness, right? Whether it was Slick Rick with Hey Young World or NWA, you know what I'm saying? With like express yourself. Like there's all of these moments where people are telling you, like, you know, you're bigger than your circumstances. You know what I'm saying? You could be anything that you want to be. And I think that was something that was very needed in the community, for me individually, but I think collectively as a whole.
And what about the darker side, the horrors that young people face growing up in New York City? You know, you mentioned the NWA, you mentioned Slick Rick. For all the positivity that was in Hey Young World, it actually maybe dawned on me just a month ago. I listened to Slick Rick's children's story. And even as fun as that song was, as much as we danced to that song, you know, throughout the past 40 years, that song has themes of police brutality, and also how the Black community and young Black men deal with police, and that, you know, the cop shot the kid. I still hear him scream.
Yep.
It maybe dawned on me like a month ago, like, yo, we're still dealing with these problems in our community that Slick Rick was rapping about, that NWA was rapping about in '88. To talk about also the beacon, the necessity for the rest of the world, maybe for Middle America, maybe for other countries, maybe for people who didn't come from the inner cities, to hear these messages, to really know what was going on and what the youth were facing.
Absolutely. You know, I stand by this, and I will always say that I will die on this hill, that rappers are the greatest writers of our time, right? And I think that they are not only our spokespeople, but they broadcast the news and what's happening in urban environments to the masses, right? The things that mainstream media may not necessarily talk about or discuss, the burden and onus of that has always fallen on the young voices from our community to speak up. And I think that it's been an important vehicle and tool just for messaging what's going on, you know, whether that's politically, whether that's just like even within the hood, like the micro kind of, you know, like the things that I think the cultural touchstones that are so minute and very specific to who we are that people may not know. It happens even today. Like, you know, I think when we think about whether it's police brutality or like just looking at the current culture and drill music and what that is speaking to socially at large, and what that means and the implications of what that music is, and also what is happening on the ground with these young people and the circumstances that in many ways produce the type of environments that they're living in. I think hip hop has always been that, you know, and again, I just kind of feel like we have always had the onus of letting people know what is happening in urban communities and impoverished communities and Black communities, brown communities, in ways that no other platform or outlets can.
Right. You know, so I think it's important to have this discussion with you and paint this picture of where you were in your life when you discovered hip hop and when hip hop affected you and inspired you. What I'd like to get into next is your transition from being a fan, from being a young kid, taking all of these messages in, taking all this art in, taking all this inspiration in. And then when you decide to be an artist yourself and transmit out and attract people that way. What made you want to be an artist?
I think I was always an artist. Anyone who knows me knows that like my first love, even before hip hop, was just drawing and illustration. I wanted to be a cartoonist. And I think that hip was also a gateway for that in the graffiti. Seeing the graffiti characters next to, you know, like incredible lettering. That was something that always just caught my eye and had me enamored. I think talking about community, like one of my childhood friends, Lou, his older brother was a rapper, and he was so influential. Just seeing him, it really distilled the reality of hip hop for me, right? Like it's one thing to see it on a screen. It's another thing to see someone who you know that does it, who's performing and who's out there, or who's affiliated with the artist that you look up to. And it was just this love. I think so much of it was always in community. To bring it back to where I was, I mean, I fell in love with hip hop when I was like 8. I was in 3rd grade. You know, we're living in housing projects in East Flatbush, Brooklyn, And, you know, I'm a latchkey kid. I walk to and from school by myself. I have, you know, I'm growing up in a single parent home. I have an older sibling, my sister. You know, my mom is working really hard. And, you know, I have a great community, though. Like, there's this extended network of support. So it's not just the folks that I have, you know, in my home, my uncle, and my aunts, or even my dad, you know, who's also around and present, but just this extended family of community, whether it's my teachers, my friends, and their parents. And what made me fall in love was what was just the energy in it, because it was youthful. It spoke to me in a way that I identified with it. You know, like I loved this Slick Rick's eye patch and rope chains. I loved Big Daddy Kane having Scoop and Scrap and the dancers, and I wanted to do the dances. Like, there was a coolness that I was attracted to, you know, and that was and I remember like writing my first rhyme, like listening to Red Alert again on a Friday night with a little notepad that I would write my homework in, you know, and jotting down my first rhyme. And that was the beginning of me even exploring hip hop as something that I could do. And I also think that it's important to note that hip hop is probably the one musical genre where there is no prerequisite for participation, right? As long as you have good intentions, you don't need musical equipment, you don't need to have taken tons of classes, or you know, all you need is the heart and the drive to do it, and you can instantly participate.
Right. But it does take community to participate. So you mentioned your friend Lou, who went by the name Graf. Like, you know, in order to be a musical artist, you do need the music. So, you know, it's linking up with other kids in your neighborhood. Like, you might rap and Lou does the beats.
Yep.
And then, you know, you do your own artwork, but you might need somebody to do some artwork for you. You might need a photographer to take pictures so you can get your mixtape covers right. Talk about the group of friends, or the group or the community that you built, even just being an artist, because no one person is an island. Like, it does really take a group of people.
Absolutely. You know, I have an extended community, and I think that when hip hop started to get real for me, I have to very much give a shout out to my guy Vidal Goring, who was the product manager at Fortress Records, which was an independent label in the mid to late 90s that gave birth to a very influential and popular underground hip hop group, Natural Elements. And so I had my friends. There was Lou, there was David, and we were just making rhymes, you know, like we would come up with rhymes and we sit on the phone three-way and we would kick the verses all day. And then I connected with Vidal and Charlemagne, the producer, and that was like my introduction to becoming a recording artist, transitioning from someone who was just writing rhymes and studying Pharaoh Monch and Prince Poe or Boot Camp Click and Duck Down and everything that was happening on that side, to actually trying to find my voice on record.
Yeah.
So, you know, that's really what kind of cemented and planted those initial kind of steps for me taking the next leap towards my artistry. Right.
And for those listening, just real quick, when you mentioned Charlemagne as a producer being early on, we're talking not Charlemagne the guy, who was actually a close friend of mine, but you're talking about Charlemagne the producer. For those watching, produced for Jay-Z, Blueprint 2, the song Blueprint 2 off of the album Blueprint 2. Charlemagne made that beat. I believe he produced for Mary J. Blige.
J. Blige, Monica, So Gone. You know, lots of really incredible credits. The War Report for Capone and Noriega, he had a bunch of, you know, songs on that classic album. But yeah, you know, I would say that was part of it. And I think that, again, the community, like, hip hop was still so insular. I was coming from Brooklyn going to the Bronx, which was legitimately a 2-hour ride in one direction every weekend with my friends in pursuit of this thing called hip hop, right? And just to be able to grow, just to be able to participate and say, hey, we're affiliated and associated with this crew who we've looked up to, who we've been listening to on college radio. You know, the voices that became like stars to us were you know, the Martin Moores and Mayhems, and you know, there's always the talk about the Stretch and Bobitos, but it was definitely like this drive and willingness to participate, also to contribute to the canon in some way, right? It was like, how can we contribute? Because that was so deeply ingrained in who we were and what the aspirations were really about. It was like, yeah, we want to put records out, but we also want to be known and be looked at by our peers as like credible lyricists, as people who are contributing and moving the art form forward.
Yeah. You know, for those who don't know, obviously we're speaking with Franklin Rossman. Your recording name, at least for part of your career, The Incomparable Shakespeare, is what you recorded under, is what many people who know you as. You know, something, again, when we're just on the subject of community, right, and how we grow community and how hip hop starts very small in New York City, but spreads over the world. One of the things that you did that was really impressive several years ago, when we talk about the globalization of hip hop, is you made a project called The British Invasion, where maybe early on in your career, you had your sights set on, I want to be the best MC on my block. Okay, I want to be known throughout New York City for my rapping skills. You know, I want to get played on Hot 97. I want to get on a K-Slay mixtape. To the point where you drop The British Invasion and your sights are set wider on globalization, realizing that hip hop is bigger than just the city that you were raised in. Can you talk about your mindset at that time and what you were seeing that made you want to drop that British Invasion mixtape?
Wow, you were taking us back. Shout out to that. You know, I think that when the British Invasion, when I started working on the British Invasion, which was around 2008, I was collaborating with a really good friend, my guy Omar, also known as Silver, incredible producer. And I just had this idea, and I think what it was that, like, I consider myself to be a really expansive artist, and anyone who knows me knows that, like, I don't think that I necessarily fall under the or in the traditional conventions of like what you would see a rapper as, right? Like, I come from an aesthetic of, I would say, A Tribe Called Quest and the Native Tongues or the Jungle Brothers, and I like to explore music and sound and what that looks like, even though I'm rapping. And I think with the British Invasion specifically, I was in a place where I was also consuming a lot of different music at that time. I was like, you know, my palette was starting to shift, not so much away from hip hop, but again, I was just growing and I was expanding. So I was listening to a lot of Brit pop. I was listening to Amy Winehouse, who I thought had an incredible album that Mark Ronson and Salaam Remi had produced. I was listening to Duffy. I was listening to Block Party, like, you know, more kind of indie rock that people might not have known. I had discovered Adele when she was literally maybe 18 or 19, and she just had a single that I fell in love with. I thought it was a beautiful record. And I think for me, one of the things I've always thought, like, while hip hop is an incredible genre that has defined me in so many ways, I wanted to make beautiful music, right? So taking this hip hop sensibility of, you know, you make something out of nothing, or you take something pre-existing and you flip it, you remix it, you reinterpret it. That's what I did. All of the stuff that I was like really digging at that time, I was like, what would it look like? What would it feel like? What would it sound like for me to reinterpret this music, put my spin on it, do it in such a way that it is authentically and organically hip hop, but in a way that it is different enough that it is beautiful. It has a lot of musicality, still is rich in lyricism. So that's kind of where I was at. I was, you know, again, I think I was just really in a place of growth and expansion. And the music was talking to me in such a way. And I was like, I think that this is uncharted territory. And it was important for me to go there. And I also think that that's part of hip hop, right? Hip hop is doing the untraditional or taking the road less traveled. And I felt that it was so hip hop to do that, because it was almost counterculture, which hip hop has always been, right? When everybody's running right, you go left.
Mm-hmm. No, that's amazing, and shout out to you. You know, an amazing feat. I don't know how you were able to pull it off, but Adele's record "Hometown" is something that you sampled, shot a video for, and I remember the video was in rotation on MTV. Actually played the video for a time consistently.
Yeah,
which was great. Talk to me about you know, obviously, and you know, we talk about the growth of hip hop, and I would just love to get your take on this. Obviously, hip hop worldwide, and it's not just English. Different countries, Russia, you know, practice, create, perform hip hop in Russia. France has a big hip hop movement. There's a huge hip hop movement in Japan. Um, the spirit of hip hop is global and translates globally, even if we all don't speak the same language. Can you talk about why you think that is?
You know, I think that hip hop in so many ways is a music of youth culture. I think it is a music of rebellion. I think it is a music that is also incredibly unapologetic in its expression of authenticity. And I think everyone can relate to that. I also believe that, as I mentioned before, you know, you don't have to be classically trained in anything to participate in it. So I think the low barrier of entry is what makes it so easy to get into, but also it's a communal thing. I think all of these factors compounded upon each other kind of create this incredible mixture, gumbo, if you will, of factors that like make people attracted to it and absolutely want to get into it. Like I remember hearing MC Solar back in the days, right? Like one of the first French MCs that I remember, or international artists, right? Like who from France that started to make a wave. And I remember being like, even though I don't know what he's saying, the energy was there. Like I could rock with it because it felt dope. Like there was all of what made hip hop dope to me was still present in the music, even if there was this language barrier and I didn't understand what the content was. But I definitely believe that hip hop, for all intents and purposes, because of its ability to give voice to the voiceless, and give a platform to young people to speak out and be heard, and also find community. That's what everyone, you know, and I think that it, you know, I've always defined hip hop as ingenuity in light of limited resources. Personally, like that's always when you don't have anything, or when you have limited resources, how can you think creatively out of the box to create something with it? And hip hop has done that with music time and time again. Like, you know, I even think about like breakdancing and how that at a time was conflict resolution when gang violence was crazy in New York. Like it's always just this level of ingenuity, of resourcefulness that you know produces something in hip hop. And I think that that's why it has been able to travel so far and so wide. That's why it's such a global phenomenon. That's why people everywhere across the globe can participate, because you don't, all it requires is ingenuity and heart.
Yeah, beautifully put. I just want to reset for a second for anybody who had joined us a little late. My name is Rob Markman, and I'm your moderator today. And this is Hip Hop at 50 Transforming Communities, a conversation with an artist and an educator, Franklin Rossman. And, you know, we started our conversation talking about the discovery of hip hop in New York City and what the community was like around you, Franklin, when you became a fan. Then you transitioning into an artist and the reach that you were able to have. I mean, from having videos played on MTV, being played on New York radio, doing shows all across the country, collaborating, forming bonds. Also, real quick, you guys can ask questions in the chat on social media. Towards the last 15 minutes, we'll get to your questions. So please keep those questions coming. But Franklin, you know, your evolution as an artist led you into an interesting arena that I want to talk about as an educator.
Yes.
We talked about hip hop early on as a form of entertainment, a form of expression, a form of maybe validating your identity and things that you were feeling and seeing going on in the world around you was also happening in the music. So you know you're not alone. We talk about you as an artist emitting your art and drawing people in. When did you realize that hip hop, not just as a form of entertainment, not just as a form of art, but that hip hop can be an educational tool for you to learn things like language and expression and critical thinking skills? When did that dawn on you?
I think so. I'd have to answer that in two parts, right? I think, again, going back to community, it had always existed. In my growth as an artist, the way my friends and I would dissect lyrics, right? Even understanding how we would construct and write our rhymes with multisyllabic rhymes, triple syllable rhymes, these things that like are known to lyricists who practice the craft, who develop their, writing chops. And I think there was always this awareness of the word, of language, and how we were manipulating it, how we were flipping it, right? And I think as I got older and, while I was still making music, I started to think, how could this be applicable to young people in the classroom? Like, so one of my first jobs was, I was a paraprofessional, so I was a teacher's aide. And I had started an extracurricular club, like a hip hop club. And I had friends in the industry who would send me promo materials, magazines to distribute to the kids. And again, we were starting to have have these really deep conversations about lyrics and what it meant, or who, who was the better MC. And these kids are like really developing these critical thinking skills and just being analytical about like who's better and why, and being able to articulate themselves. And I think having a language and a lexicon for education and academia, I was like, oh, snap. I could really translate this thing that I know intimately as a practitioner, as an artist, and translate that into language arts. So, like I think about records like Common's I Used to Love Her, which is a classic hip hop song, right? We all knew that that was extended metaphor. There was no one in hip hop who didn't. But I don't know that there were many people who were on the other side in education who could, one, explicitly say that or teach it or bring it to a classroom and audience that might be familiar with the record, may not be familiar with the record, but could break it down in a way that it would be relatable and teach it in the same way that they would need to know Edgar Allan Poe, or they would need to read, To Kill a Mockingbird, or anything for that matter. And I really started to take this thing that I knew intimately and incredibly well from the conversations that I had been having with my friends for years, conversations I've been having with you, conversations I've been having with my guy, Alex, Absolute, conversations I've been having with all of my friends who rap and rap really well. And I thought that like being in this educational space, and I was like, I could really translate this in a way that would make sense and would resonate with kids that came from similar upbringings that I did, who grew up in communities like I did, because they would have a point of reference. And I think as a philosophy, it was really, and not to get too much into education, but there were areas where I felt like the education system could be improved. And my personal philosophy was to give young people practical applications of what they're learning, right? How could they see themselves in and learn through people that they're familiar with, through mediums that they're familiar with, and be able to grow and develop the tools to be successful as young people, as adults, as contributors to society. So it was all of that stuff that was happening in terms of like my transition and figuring out like, how do I position hip hop in the room and do it in such a way that also gives credibility to the music too, right? I think that was a big thing for me, understanding that hip hop wasn't, even as it was starting to grow and become this cultural phenomenon, there was still this disconnect in what the rappers were doing in their music, in the art. And I thought that it was a great way to bridge both of those things, give young people practical applications of what they need to know to pass a Regents exam, to pass an English. Thought about a Jay-Z or a Lupe Fiasco at the time, or, you know, whoever it was at the moment.
Give me an example of maybe one of your most favorite lessons or parallels of taking a Jay-Z or a Lupe or a Kanye West and using it to actually teach a child something that maybe otherwise could have went over their head if you know, hadn't.
Absolutely. You know, so Jay-Z had this song called Meet the Parents, and I would always use that as an explicit allegory, right? While still deconstructing every single literary device that he was using in the song. In the beginning, you know, there's foreshadowing, and of course there's similes and metaphors, which are readily used by so many rappers, but there's things like that. You know, I think the mom's name was Isis, and you know, juxtaposing Isis, you know, in Egyptian lore and to, you know, like in the similarities. So there's all of these moments that I would take these records, but also like I think about Lupe, and he has the He Say She Say off of his first album, the classic, right? Food and Liquor. And I think what he does on that record, He Say She Say, and simply just changing the pronoun and how it dramatically shifts perspective of the song, how it's the mother talking to the father, and by, you know, the second verse when he goes he, you know, it's the son speaking to the father, and how that changes the emotion and how evocative that is. I think about, again, Common, and I think about a song off of his sophomore album, Resurrection, Communism, and just alliteration and how he's compounding alliteration in these really unique ways. Like, so I'm deconstructing all, you know, that there's all of this that happens. I mean, one of the first things that we would do, even before we got into that stuff, while I was at Columbia University working in partnership with Harlem Children's Zone, we would have the kids, we would show videos of that. There was this great program that used to be on MTV, you know, Top 10 Rappers, right? Where there was a round table and folks would debate who was the top 10. And from that, I would ask the kids who were their top 10, but I would have them build a rubric of what qualifies a top 10 artist. So we would, you know, legitimately start by defining certain things, like what is flow, what is swag, like, and they would create metrics for their top 10 so that we would have a unified language to build upon when we're discussing these rappers and having these debates to qualify who's the better lyricist or who's not. And you know, so it's all of these kinds of things. But yeah.
I know the MTV roundtable very well. I used to be one of the guys on the roundtable. Yeah, it's different when you make your list on TV and then Rapper A doesn't make it and you see him out in the street. And interesting times. Talk about, you know, even your name, right? Like your rap name. You talked about the incomparable Shakespeare. Obviously Shakespeare, one of just the greatest poets, one of the greatest just writers, forever. And we study him in school, and you know, I'm pretty sure Shakespeare is studied just about all around the world. What makes Shakespeare different from Nas? Or, you know, like because I think what you're kind of getting at is saying, hey, this is great too, but we have modern day poets, we have modern day writers who are also just as great and deserve to be studied in a similar fashion.
And I would sit there and say that, not to discredit the brilliant works of the Bard, but I do think that there is no difference between a Nas, between a Lil Baby, and the writers, the authors, the poets that we have studied for so long. And I think that that's always been part of my mission as an educator, to help in defining and establishing the credibility of rappers. You know, I think that, you know, like for Shakespeare, you know, I think people are would most identify Shakespeare for sonnets and other devices like but when I think about Nas and his storytelling and the lyricists, like there's so much, right, that I don't think that there's a difference. For me, it's hard to delineate what would make this person any different than the other. I think sometimes hip hop's origin and its cultural background is what people have defined as the difference. But for me, as someone who has consumed it, who has lived it, who I breathe it, when I think about the depth and the brilliance of what I've listened to over the years and the ways in which I've deconstructed it, there is no difference. You know, I think about guys that may not be household names, but I think about a guy like an A Butter, and I remember, or even a Graph, right? There's a rapper from Queens named Graph, incredible lyricist. And I remember hearing Graph and A Butter like on a mixtape, and they're literally rhyming independent clauses for an entire 16 bar. And like, it's blowing my mind because it's not, and I hate to get into technique, but it's not rhyming cat and hat. It's literally rhyming an entire sentence and doing it syllable for syllable. And it's like, for that to be coherent, to make sense, do you know how your mind has to think, how your brain has to work to like process and create that? And also to be able to do it in rhythm, in me. That reason, I think that like there is no difference. Whether we're talking about from a structural, disciplined writing perspective, I think whether from a storytelling perspective and talking about characterization, Slick Rick, you know, all of them up there with all of not only the greatest writers throughout history, but all of the the filmmakers, you know, like they're all in the same breath. I think they're just doing it through a very different medium. So for me, it's always like kind of trying to connect those dots so that people can understand genuine brilliance here.
Right.
You know.
My next question, and then after the questions in chat, please submit questions on social media, and we'll get into those. Hip hop, 50 years.
Yes.
If you could surmise in our first 50 years of this culture, what do you think is the biggest accomplishment, the biggest contribution of hip hop to the world? And second part of that question is, where would you like to see hip hop go for the next 50?
Wow. I think that it's interesting because in some ways, I think you've said and articulated what I truly believe is hip hop's contribution. I think hip hop is America's greatest contribution to world culture. I think that hip hop as a cultural movement, as a culture in itself, composed of MCing, breaking, DJing, graffiti, I think fashion, I think this sensibility of ingenuity, of upward mobility, like hip hop has distilled that to the world. And I think that that's an indelible imprint that can't be taken away. I think moving forward, young people will always identify with this unapologetic form of music and culture because it gives us voice. And I think that it's a beautiful thing. So like that's really what I think hip hop's major contribution, bigger than an artist, bigger than a song, bigger than a dance. I think it's this ethos almost, right? Like really like a deep rooted ethos that it's contributed to world culture. And I think where would I like to see hip hop go for the next 50 years? I think I would like to see hip hop evolve in ways that continues to be more inclusive, right? I think we're seeing that now. I think we're in a moment in time where the women in hip hop are at the forefront. There are tons of like dope women who are just like killing it, like incredible lyricists, you know, the Chicas, the Tierra Wax, the Flo Millies, the Megan Thee Stallions. Like there's all of these really dope lyricists that are women, and they're at the forefront. The Rhapsodies, the Nicki Minaj's, like we've never had this much or so many women at the forefront at a singular moment in time. And I think that that's dope. And I want to see that expanded in so many other ways. I think when we're talking about how hip hop can grow, I want to see that, you know, in different ethnicities and different cultures, and how, because hip hop is constantly transforming, you know, and although it's been assimilated in so many different ways, I just want to see what the evolution of that is on a really global level. You know, the fact that Bad Bunny may not be identified as a hip hop artist, there's hip hop sensibilities in Bad Bunny, and he's the largest artist in the world, right? Like, so I think that that's dope. So, you know, I think I want to see the continued evolution in that way.
Absolutely, man. Thank you for that. I want to take some questions from the chat, from our audience, from those that are watching. And we have a couple. So I'm going to read them out. First, I want to shout out Eddie Goolsby. All right. Great question right here. The question is, why is hip hop so much a part of our cultural identity and our society a half century later?
That's a really profound question. I know, right? We're starting off with a deep question. You know, I think, and I think I've alluded to this earlier, I really believe that it's because any and everyone can participate in it, right? I think that socially, culturally, even in sports, right, there's always barriers, right? Whether we see it in the isms, whether that's racism, sexism, classism, you know what I'm saying? Like, where there are legitimate barriers. And I think that hip hop doesn't have that. And I think that because people can participate in it in varying degrees, right? Like, you could be involved in hip hop and not be an enthusiast, right? And I think that that's one of the reasons why it stayed for so long, right? You could participate in the ways in which it serves purpose and brings value to you, while there are enthusiasts such as myself, such as Rob, such as, you know, it's something that everyone can get with on some level, in some way, some shape or form, right? Whether that's rocking Adidas like Run DMC, not having or not tying your shoelaces, right? That's such an inherent hip hop thing. People may not know it, right? You buy some sneakers, you don't tie them. That's rooted in hip hop. You might not even connect the dots when you get the sneakers and you take them out the box and not tie them, but like, even that small gesture is a participation in this much larger culture and art form.
Right. Yeah, that's a great answer. Zalata wants to know, what advice would you give to aspiring musicians and educators?
Oh, to inspiring musicians, I would say make it move from the heart. Always tap into your most truthful, most authentic, most vulnerable self, because I think that that is the gift of an artist and a musician, right? To speak your truth, and there are tons of people who can relate and who will be able to identify to that truth. I think as an educator, I think the advice I would give is, like, one, learn the population that you're serving, right? Like, really know who it is that you're serving, whether you're teaching adults or young kids. Know who they are and speak to them in ways that matter. You know, I think it's important to be there for the right intentions and to want to have an impact, but it's equally as important as an educator to be mindful of the demographic you're serving at any given point in time. You know, what are the tools that they might need to be successful, you know, and to also just be caring. You know what I'm saying? Lead with your heart. Lead with your heart.
Let me ask you this as a piggyback question, because I thought that was a great question, and that was a great answer that you gave. Know the demographic that you're serving. You know, me being a longtime friend of yours, and you know, I know kind of the things that you have faced. And I, you know, with respect to your students' privacy, Can you talk about the situations that you've been in? You've been in situations where the students aren't just there to learn or to pass a test or to make a grade, but there were real safety issues and safety concerns about these kids when they leave school or when they leave your care, what they have to face when they go out those doors. Hunger and security issues,
Yes.
kids just needing a meal. Can you kind of talk about the environments that you were in and how you showed up for those kids, not to just help them get a good grade, but be a safe space for them when the world around them isn't so kind?
Absolutely. I think that that's always been something that I led with. It's also been a part of my practice in pedagogy, which is to help and foster the social and emotional intelligence of the young people that I work with, right? Whether they're facing housing insecurity, whether they are facing food insecurity, or just like living in, conditions that might be volatile, right? Like, how can I help them navigate these spaces, better equip themselves to know how to move and find the necessary supports? How can I personally be of support, right? I think as an educator, we extend ourselves to the people that we work with because we're endeared to them, right? Especially when they're younger. But I think that I'm always thinking about that more than anything that I could teach you in terms of being able how to pass a test. It's almost a Jay-Z line, because like when I think about literacy, right? Literacy comes in all of these contexts. Literacy is just not the written and spoken word or the read word. I think literacy is being able to have the emotional intelligence and social intelligence to be able to read a room, and to, it's like when Jay says, I teach you how to move in a room full of vultures. It's like being able to assess these things and be equipped and as adept at reading a paragraph and reading anything else or deconstructing any other language in which it comes in, right? Because like, for example, like we're in a space where you got to be, you have to be technologically literate, right? You got to be AI literate now. It's all of these things. So it's also just like the social literacy and being able to move through spaces with that.
Right. The chat also wants to know, and again, for those who have followed, but I'll give a brief summation. I mean, you've been rapping and putting out music since the 90s, the incomparable Shakespeare. You've recently made the shift and have been putting out music and across all DSPs as Franklin Rossman, which is your birth name.
Yep.
So there's been a transition, there's been a growth of your artistry, and the chat wants to know, where are you taking your new music?
Oh man, that's a great question. I'm really excited about the new music. And honestly, it's been a while. And I think that at this stage in my life, the music is a bit more mature, right? I think it still has the tenets of hip hop. I'm rhyming. I'm collaborating with my guy, John Solo, who's an incredible producer and musician all around. And I really am striving to, again, push the boundaries in the same way that Rob referenced the British invasion. I think that right now I'm looking to carve a niche in what I'm calling adult contemporary hip hop, right? Sonically something that sounds like the hip hop I know and love, that I appreciate most, but also speaks to where I'm at just in terms of my age, right? So I'm not trying to compete with the younger artists who I appreciate and I listen to, but they already have that space. They give voice to what their experiences are in their 20s, 30s. You know what I'm saying? I think just I'm talking about the things that are really relative to my life in this moment, while still trying to do it in a way that like you could groove to it, you could appreciate it, and it's like drop some gems on them.
Can you talk about the time that we're in now? Because it wasn't always like this. Hip hop was often described and marketed to us as a young person's game, and it is, I think, for the youth. You alluded to that. It will always be attractive to the youth for generations to come. But now we're getting into this space where artists are allowed to grow older and more mature in hip hop, like they are in rock and roll. There's no age limit on, nobody's telling Mick Jagger that he has to hang it up at 70. Yeah. Country, there's no age limit if you're in country. There's no age limit if you're in R&B. There used to be kind of this unspoken age limit in hip hop, which now, whatever that ceiling was, seems to be dissipating. when you're seeing artists like Nas win his first Grammy at this point in his career, and Jay-Z put out albums like 444. Yep. Can you just talk about that and where we are as a culture with ageism?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, it is part of the natural progression of things. I think the hip hop is growing. I think that for someone such as myself, like, you're talking about a journey of hip hop of literally over 40 years, right? Like, me consuming hip hop in 1988 as an 8-year-old, or falling in love with Slick Rick, and that being my first album, like the first thing that I owned, while still having some reference to Run DMC from my sister, and you know, I think as it has become larger and as it continues to grow, there has to be space for all of us who have grown up with it to still consume and participate in it. Maybe not in the same ways, right? But as someone who is always going to be or wants to be on the pulse of hip hop fashion, as someone who also wants to know what's the newest wave musically, I still want to hear from the artists who have been impactful for me. So I think, like, even Nas, what he's been able to do in the last 2 years has been unprecedented. Like, you know what I'm saying? 5 projects, but they're mature projects, right? I don't know that the audience that listens to NBA YoungBoy is singing Brunch on Sundays or can relate to that, but like, that's my experience. So I think that in terms of this age ceiling dissipating, I think it's natural. I think it's going to take time, but clearly with hip hop at 50, it is really beginning to cement its position as world culture. And I think we're only going to see the evolution of that more. I think it's going to take a couple more steps from the gatekeepers, the people who have been the most prolific, like the Nas's or the Jay-Z's, who drop the 444 and start to address these much more mature themes. But I think as long as that continues to happen, we'll continue to see the music grow in a way that lends itself to people from very different, varying generations with it.
Right. Franklin, man, thank you for your time, for your insight, for peeking to your mind and in your heart and your motivation. Before we end, just where can people find you? Where can people find your work? I would love for you to shout that out.
Got it. Well, I would say that you can find me on social media at Franklin Rossman. That is my handle on Twitter. That is also my YouTube handle. That is also my Instagram handle, TikTok handle. You know, in terms of the older stuff, if you go on the DSPs, the Apple Music, the streaming services that you have, wherever it is, Spotify, you can find my music under Franklin Rossman and The Incomparable Shakespeare, right? So, you know, depending on, you'll find much more stuff under The Incomparable Shakespeare than you will Franklin Rossman, but you know, it's there. I want to really say thank you, and I really wish everyone has a great evening, but this has really been an honor to kind of share space and time with you guys, to share space with my friend Rob Markman. I thank you, and I also want to thank the American Center in Moscow for having me. This has been a great opportunity. I hope it's been insightful, you know. Yeah.
That's it. Thank you all. Thank you for tuning in. Yes, thank you to the American Center in Moscow, and for everybody who tuned in, and once again to Franklin Rossman. It's been my pleasure. My name is Rob Markman, and I hope you all have a wonderful evening.
Have a good evening, y'all.